The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Good evening and welcome to my State of Mind. I am Dan Yorke. This is something, right? What we experienced last night with the presidential debate is something that we've never experienced before. I'm not one to necessarily want to get my dander up or pennies in a bundle over the way politicians behave with each other, but that was something that, was unexplainable and I don't think good for America. Joe Fleming, our leading pollster here in Rhode Island, will try to break it down in what is his typically pretty simplified fashion, which is good for us. First, though, let's see what the network reported on what went on last night.
There was little order throughout much of the first presidential debate.
The question is, Justice, radical left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
This
Who's
is
on your
so
list?
right.
Gentlemen, I think
This
we've
is
ended
so
this.
He's going to pack the court.
We have ended.
not going to give a list.
President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden were asked about 6 topics. The first was the open Supreme Court seat.
We won the election. Elections have consequences.
Biden said President Trump's nominee, Judge Amy Coney Barrett, will vote to dismantle the Affordable Care Act.
He won't ever look you in the eye and say that's what he wants to do. Take it away.
No, I want to give them better health care.
The two then clashed over the handling of the coronavirus pandemic.
The same man
It's
who
all
told
set
you
up.
by Easter this would be gone away.
He wants to shut down this country. And I want to keep it open.
At times, President Trump tried to focus on Biden's family.
I don't know, Bo. I know Hunter.
Yeah,
Hunter got thrown out of the military. He was thrown out, dishonorably discharged.
That's not true.
A CBS News poll found 69% of viewers felt annoyed by the debate. 48% thought Biden won. 41% say the president did.
He just pours gasoline in the fire.
Late in the debate, President Trump was asked to disavow white supremacy, leading to perhaps the most controversial and buzzed about response of the evening.
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
The next presidential debate is scheduled for October 15th.
And so our friend Joe Fleming joins the broadcast. He is the state's leading pollster, and I don't know how you poll that debate. I don't know what you do now to make sense of this presidential race. Joe, without getting into the data, as we say here in Rhode Island, A, good evening, and B, what's just forget your pollster acumen and expertise. What does Joe Fleming, the citizen, say about what he saw last night?
Well, totally unexpected, Dan. I expected Donald Trump to be aggressive last night, but not as aggressive as he was. It turned out to be a train wreck last night. I think the only thing the voters are going to remember is that it was a train wreck. They're not going to remember any of the issues that were talked about last night, just on how bad the debate was, how Chris Wallace could not control the debate last night. And these are the images that are going to be out there. Now, the thing is, if I'm Donald Trump, I'm trailing in all the national polls and even the battleground state polls. I don't think last night's going to move the needle for him at all. I think the Biden supporters are still there. The Trump supporters are still there. And though that 10 or 12% undecided voters are saying, what the heck is going on?
If I could list 4 or 5, content issues in that debate last night, still his lack of response to the white supremacy question, the battle over the Bidens and the boys, which was unbelievable. Joe Biden kind of missing one of the questions in terms of whether he had police endorsement. I mean, Biden didn't have a brilliant debate by any stretch of the imagination, but I mean, I can find a half a dozen things to extract, talk about. How's that going to affect the people? You don't go there.
No, I agree with you, Dan. You could find 6, 7, 8 things from the debate last night that each candidate said either right or wrong. However, the general public, the person going to work this morning, what is the one thing they're saying about the debate last night? It was a train wreck. They were yelling at each other, basically. The moderator didn't have control. That's what people will be talking about at the water cooler today, not simply white supremacy or the coronavirus. It's about how the debate was out of control last night.
Okay, underneath that, let's talk about the coronavirus and the answers back and forth.
Joe Biden, when he spoke about it, spoke directly to the American people. That's the one thing I think Joe Biden did well last night. At times, he turned to the camera and spoke directly to the American people. I think on coronavirus, that was one of those instances. Donald Trump's answer was simply, well, if you were president, there would have been 2 million people dead. And I don't think that plays well with the voters. They want to know answers. His answer is simply the vaccine's going to solve it. Joe Biden is saying the experts say it's going to take a lot longer. Donald Trump says it's going to happen right away.
Right. Yeah, I thought the president's reaction on the coronavirus, his arguments that he prevented millions of infections with his China ban for travel and all that kind of stuff. It's his most formidable argument, I think, when it comes to the jumpstart of the virus. But to be talking about, like, it would be 2 million for you because you disagreed with the China thing and blah, blah, I think people just kind of look at that and say, it felt like a 13-year-old arguing with a 12-year-old over, well, my daddy does this versus my daddy does that. It doesn't seem to stick, right?
No, it doesn't stick, and that's his problem. The last thing he wanted to talk about last night was a coronavirus. That's his real.
So how in heaven's name could anybody think that you could avoid a debate on the coronavirus?
Well, part of it was doing what he did last night, really making the debate a train wreck, really being very aggressive, probably over-aggressive for himself, where people today are not talking about Donald Trump's response to the coronavirus. They're talking about how bad the overall debate was last night. The less he gets the coronavirus in the media, the better for him. But again, I think Biden's going to look for things last night that he could take out of it to show on Trump. But people hear all this all the time about Donald Trump. It's nothing new.
Right. All right. When we come back with Joe Fleming, we'll talk about what this election, how this election unfolds and what the role of each base will be. I heard some things. I had to move around. Listen, we all have our own take on that debate, but I had to move around the networks last night and see the different takes. And I'll tell you, you want to talk about a tale of two countries. It is unbelievable. But the notion that perhaps what Donald Trump did, full throttle, engage his base, is something we should discuss with Joe Fleming when we come back on My State of Mind. Please stay with us. Welcome back to My State of Mind. Joe Fleming, Rhode Island's lead pollster, who really knows how to simplify what the public reaction is likely to be to political events and the like. It's why a lot of people go to him, because he's able to just kind of get into the gut and core reaction. Joe, we keep talking about how the public sees politics. We've done it for so many years. And, often it's frustrated me, as I said in the last segment, that you just kind of keep it pretty cookie cutter, man. It's pretty cookie cutter because America receives its stuff in a cookie cutter fashion.
Right.
Has it always received its stuff in a cookie cutter fashion?
Fairly much. I mean, politicians, you have the 30-second commercial. They're not on there for 3 or 4 minutes doing an explanation of their issues. They're trying to narrow it down to 30 to 60 seconds. Voters don't want to listen for 15 to 20 minutes on some issues. They want the cookie cutter thing on here's what it is and what it stands for. Donald Trump's very good at that. Over the 4 years and when he was running for president, he got things down very simple for the voters. They understood. And I mean, he's been a master at that over these 4 years. Now it may hurt him.
So we'll talk more about how the people will receive this stuff as we go here. But here's my question. I was watching the coverage last night. Clearly we can all determine for ourselves what we saw, but being in the business, I'm going to check around, and it is a tale of two countries, clearly. But even within the Fox coverage, and even the Hannity program last night, there were some voices saying, I don't know, man. You got to make your message stick inside the room that you're in. So the criticism of Donald Trump was much milder than you would find anywhere else. But, there were advocates on that network last night who were saying, y'all missed it. It was a brilliant night for Donald Trump. He energized his base to the point where You got to recognize that this election is only about the base. And I was thinking, I don't know that the base is big enough for the election only to be about the base, and that Trump got Joe Biden to a place where he couldn't endorse, say, like the Green New Deal, and that will be an erosion of the left base, so that two things were accomplished. And does that make any sense to you at all?
No, no question. Donald Trump energizes base, but he's been playing to his base for 4 years now. The problem is his base is not big enough to win the election. I mean, a lot of these key swing states, Joe Biden is over 50%. So just playing to your base is not going to work. And he's not going to take the votes on the left away from Joe Biden, because their only other choice is Donald Trump, and he's not a choice for them. So they're going to stay with Joe Biden. And while they may not get everything in like a Green New Deal and the Joe Biden's climate deal, they're going to get some of what they want. So they're going to be better off there than with Donald Trump. But Donald Trump needs to expand his base, and I don't believe he's doing that up to this point.
Yeah, I think we've seen some interesting data going into that debate last night that only somewhere between 10 and 15% of America will articulate that they're willing to change their mind. So is that the same answer, by the way, as undecided?
Not quite. That would include the undecided plus the leaners, the people that are leaning towards Donald Trump and the people that are leaning towards Joe Biden. Those are the ones who are more inclined to change their mind. But that number is small. 4 years ago, it was over 20% at this time. So right now it's between 10 and 14, 15%. So there's not a lot of movement. And the thing is, where is the movement in the swing states? I think I saw one poll yesterday, I'm not sure it was Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, where the undecided vote was 1%. So, I mean, most voters have made up their mind on this. People either like Donald Trump or they don't like Donald Trump. 4 years ago, it was, I don't like Donald Trump, but I really don't like Hillary Clinton. So there was two negatives there. Now it's Joe Biden, and people don't have a hatred for Joe Biden. Donald Trump has not been able to make this an election about Joe Biden. It's still an election all about Donald Trump. And that hurts.
Okay, so there is a difference between the I can switch and the I don't know.
Yes.
So I guess you call it what? Soft support?
Yeah, I call it the movable voters. The voters that are undecided and those that are just soft support are leaning towards Biden or leaning towards Trump. Those voters are the ones you're trying to persuade. I don't think last night did anything at all to persuade those voters, because I think they were probably frustrated at both of them. And I wonder how many of those voters just turned the TV off after about a half an hour.
Yeah,
so I've had enough of this.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know either. To be honest with you, and without actually thinking about content, going back to your point, because the train wreck is just in my mind as well. I remember thinking to myself, though, in the first few minutes of the debate, Trump's on his game tonight. I felt like he was making some articulate arguments, and then all of a sudden, the pedal went through the floorboard, and he executed a strategy that just was to burn the whole place up and leave it that way. I wonder. I just wonder where that undecided, soft, transitional vote could have been if he had taken a little bit more of a docile tone that you've seen sometimes, when he goes to the prompter and when he has had moments when he has soft played his presentation. I just thought that if he had done that, people might have gone, well, he's not that much of a, and instead he just put the pedal through the floorboard, right?
I totally agree with you. When he talks with the prompter, he's a lot better. And the other thing last night, I think you're right. He started off okay. And again, he wanted to be aggressive, but I think he went too far. I think what he should have done was backpedal a little bit and try to turn the debate talking about the economy as much as he could last night. Whatever the topic was, bring it back to the economy. That's his strength. People like what he's done with the economy. I mean, if he said to the voters last night, look, we were doing great. We went downhill, but give me 4 more years. We'll bring the economy back to where it was 6 or 7 months ago. But I need another term to get that. He didn't say that last night. He needs to give the voters a reason to reelect him. And his best argument, I believe, is the economy. And he's not using that.
Yeah. Okay. When we come back, what's next? I know we got an election, but we've got 2 more debates that are at least on the schedule. Joe Fleming and I will hash that around when we return. Stay with us. Joe Fleming, Rhode Island's leading pollster. Joe, you and I actually during the break were wondering whether that was planned or whether that was just Trump. I don't know how anybody with a tactical strategy, acumen, or talent, or expertise, or responsibility could have said to Donald Trump last night, just go in with your hair on fire and blow this whole thing up. I just don't know how that would be the game plan. Do you see any space? Is there some deep thing in the dynamic of this entire presidency and this election that you and I are missing?
I don't know, Dan. I mean, that would not have been my advice. I know he was doing a lot of debate prep with former Governor Christie and Rudy Giuliani, but I don't know if his other advisors would tell him to go and do that. I have to assume they were giving him more of a refined type of game plan for last night. And I'm just assuming Donald Trump was just being Donald Trump, playing to his base. He wants to keep energizing his base.
Yeah, but I think he's. There were some folks last night who talked about him just being angry. I think that's true. I just think there's a missing cylinder. I just think that he is so offended almost over the idea that he actually has to run for re-election that it's just like, he's just, the word is indulge. He indulged himself to a place where, I think he put himself in a real jam. However, I mean, if you're going to give credit and reach, it's not like he went at it 3/4.
No.
I mean, if it was going to be, I'm going to blow this debate up, he blew it up. I mean, blew it up. He succeeded in blowing it up. And what are we doing? We're talking all about that.
Right.
That's all we're talking about, because it was so profound that it became, as you say now, going all the way back to your premise at the beginning, it's the only thing that people are going to remember.
Exactly. But the thing is, what's happening with a lot of voters is simply they're saying, I don't like the way Donald Trump acts, but I do like a lot of the things Donald Trump has done with the economy. And that's given the people the reason to not sure what they want to do. Now with last night, that may push them one way or the other. Because he really did go overboard, I think, last night. He went farther than I think people thought he would go.
Is it fixable? Is it what is it historically? What does the first debate do versus the second and third to the election and put to polling and the eventual ultimate of the election?
First debate has the biggest audience usually. However, let's just think back to 2012, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. Barack Obama had a horrible first debate, if you remember. He looked very bad. He came back in the second debate and looked absolutely fantastic. So there is time for Donald Trump to fix what's happening here if he wants. But again, the next debate's a town hall meeting style in 2 weeks. So that might be a little bit different. But again, if Donald Trump keeps interrupting during a town hall, it could work to his negative. But there is time for him to fix what's going on. The question is, will Donald Trump want to fix what's going on, or is he happy with the way he's going? He's saying, this worked for me 4 years ago. Let's keep going.
Well, look, he was behind a month going into the election last time around. The dynamics are different. But, the idea that he's setting up that the election's going to be a fraud anyway. I don't know how he starts to soft shoe this whole thing. I think it's going to be, the hair on fire. I'm angry. This is a ripoff. Voters mailing their ballots in, blah, blah, blah. This might just be, a full sprint to election day. Angry.
Well, right now it sounds like that. But again, if he wants to change that tone, if once the polling shows things are getting worse for him and he needs to change the tone, he can still do that with the second debate. After that, it may be getting kind of late. Again, keep in mind, Dan, people are voting right now. In the state of Rhode Island, the mail ballots are going to start getting mailed out next week, I understand. So people are going to be voting. A lot of people are voting early. And in turn, if Donald Trump's falling behind now, he may not have time to turn things around. And again, Joe Biden's numbers have been consistent throughout the whole campaign, and his leads are bigger than Hillary Clinton had 4 years ago. So it's not as tight as it was 4 years ago, which is not a good sign for Donald Trump.
Yeah. All right. I wouldn't even ask you for a prediction unless you want to give me one. Are you?
After 4 years ago, you never know what's going to happen. But right now, it's looking more and more like Joe Biden is in a good position. But again, 34 days to the election on November 3rd. In politics, that could be a lifetime. You never know what's going to happen. Remember what happened with Comey towards the end with Hillary Clinton, turned things around. So there are things that could happen in the month of October.
Yeah.
That's why they call the October surprise.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that this time around, we almost have a guarantee of litigation.
Yes.
So we're not going to have a traditional election night, even the one that we had in 16 where we went, holy cow, guess what just happened? It's going to be, all right, now we begin the process of trying to figure out what just happened. It could be days, weeks, maybe months.
Some of the states put their mail ballots in as they get them through the machines. Other states wait till election night before they start counting the mail ballots.
Right.
So depending how many there are, it could take a couple of weeks or it could just take a couple of days.
All
But
right.
some states are going to know early.
Joe, thank you for your reaction. Insight is difficult in this particular election, but
It is.
yours is important. Again,
Thank you.
people see these things in a very structured and simple way. Remember that when you're evaluating the polls. Joe Fleming, thanks. So we have final word. Back. Stay with us. And so what's next in terms of these presidential debates and whether or not there'll be some kind of better temperament? Who knows? Your guess is as good as mine. It is one day at a time on so many levels these days. The election is one of them. You have a great night. Talk to you on the radio at 3 until 6 on WPRO as well. See ya.